Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Welcome everybody to this Talking Tendons podcast. I've got a special guest today. So his name is Anthony Naser, and he's an academic at UTS, which is a university in Sydney in Australia. And he's recently completed a number of studies on a very neglected, I think, tendinopathy, which is proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So he's done some really valuable work adding to the evidence base for that tendon, where we don't really have, for some reason, and we'll probably explore that today, speaking to Anthony, historically anyway, a lot of evidence. So welcome, Anthony, to the podcast.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for inviting me to share some of the findings from my PhD today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming. So yeah, look, just obviously I've been quite interested in some of the work around hamstring, and I'm sure also some of the listeners are, so it'd be really good to discuss that. But before we get into that, just obviously you've just submitted, I think, your PhD, and it was really good to see that. I think it went round, I think I might have seen it on Twitter, or something, but it was also possibly in Google Scholar. I don't know if it's reached that yet, yeah. So tell us about what you're doing at the moment. So what's sort of your mix at the moment in terms of work?
Yeah, so I'm a physiotherapist is my background, and I graduated about 13 years ago from the University of Sydney. And after a few years of clinical practice, I moved to Brisbane and studied the Master of Sports Physiotherapy. And I guess that really inspired me to, I met a lot of researchers during that time, and that inspired me to start a PhD a few years later. And so currently, I've just submitted my PhD in I guess it was finalised, and I had my ceremony in December, just of last year. And now I'm working full-time as an academic. I still, see the odd patient now, but I'm trying to spend a bit more time trying to, build a career as a sports medicine researcher.
Fantastic. That's really great. And with the patients that you see, say even during your PhD and after now, the few that you would see, is that in the sort of hamstring tendon area, or you're sort of general, sort of seeing more generally than that?
It would be specific to the hip buttock region. So patients with tendinopathy or hip-related joint pain would probably be the big makeup. But I do also see other tendinopathies as well.
Yeah, fantastic. That's great. So that's really good. And yeah, as I say, your PhD is sort of really an enticing one, a good one to read. And I would definitely recommend that people read it. You'd remember I emailed you basically as soon as I saw it on Twitter and said, "Can I have a copy?"
Yeah.
And it's not yet available because it still needs to be assessed, I believe. Is that right?
We've actually, it's been assessed, and we've just got one final paper which we want to publish. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So definitely recommend people get their hands on that. I've read bits of it, but also some of the stuff you have published, which has been good. So just interested in what sort of led you to doing a PhD. And you've sort of alluded to this already, but where did you what was your pathway to what inspired you to do a PhD, I guess, in hamstrings and tendons?
Yeah. So like I was saying earlier, I finished my Master's of Sports Physiotherapy, and I always saw myself purely as a clinician. And I worked, under a lot of really, really good physiotherapists, I guess, leading up to doing my master's. But then after I finished my master's in Brisbane, I started working for Alison Grimaldi in Brisbane, and we saw a lot of patients with tendinopathy there, and I ended up seeing a lot of different patients with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. And Alison, who's also, a fantastic, researcher and clinician, I guess, tapped me on the shoulder, and we talked about, potentially, or I guess exactly what you were talking about, how, this population is really just so underrepresented in the research. And she encouraged me to go have a chat to Bill Vincenzo and Adam Semke and start a PhD.
Excellent. And the rest is history, as they say. I love the tap on the shoulder. That's quite common in the research sort of spheres, the tap on the shoulder, identifying people you think could be really good as a PhD student. Tapping them on the shoulder tends to be a really good strategy. So that's good. That's really good. And so getting on to your PhD then, so obviously there's been, looking at it, it's a substantial bit of work, and you've done obviously lots of different bits to it, including, I think, a couple of reviews were in there.
Yeah.
And a couple of other studies. Do you want to just give a brief overview of what you've done?
Yeah. So I guess we started like most PhD students do by, I guess, getting an idea of a grasp of the literature. So we started off by performing a systematic review where we just wanted to have a look at, what was the most effective treatment, really already going into that understanding that, that there's not too much research out there. So we kept our inclusion criteria really broad. So we included all different types of study designs, as long as the case series had more than 10 participants. And, we found that, that certainly was a overrepresentation of different studies looking at, injection therapies and surgery. And there really wasn't much at all on, exercise active-based management, which we know is kind of, I guess, the type of management that we would usually see that most other tendinopathies around the body.
Can I ask you on that before you go any further? What do you reckon are some of the underlying reasons for that? Because that's something that you do see, and it's sort of an obvious thing, bit of an elephant in the room, I guess, in the tendinopathy literature, where you've got all this research on Achilles, some on patella, fair bit on patella in the lower limb, but not really much elsewhere.
Yeah.
What do you think is going on?
Yeah, I have thought about that a little bit, and I think it's because we weren't very good at rehabbing the hamstring tendon, and we probably weren't getting the results. I also think that potentially going back, I think it's better recognized now as in I guess in clinical practice, but I think historically it hasn't been recognized too well, and I think that our exercise interventions potentially weren't being very effective, and potentially that is a reason why people didn't look at them further. I'd be interested to know what you think, though, Peter.
Yeah, look, I sort of tend to agree. I think part of it is, as you say, not people not really recognizing proximal hamstring tendon as much as maybe what they do some of the other ones like Achilles. So I think possibly not. Also, I mean, one of the things I wonder is how common proximal hamstring is, and is it as common as Achilles? I know Achilles probably through the lifespan can be a bit of a problem, whereas hamstring, you sort of relate to runners and sprinters, but it obviously does affect other people.
Yeah.
I'll throw it back to you, actually. What have you got any data, because you've been knee deep in the literature on prevalence, how it compares to other things, and sort of demographic groups affected?
Well, actually, I think, as you're saying, there's actually not much data on prevalence. The only data I'm aware of was a study I actually think you might have been involved in soccer, on the prevalence of tendinopathy.
Yeah, the Barcelona data.
Yeah. And it found that, proximal hamstring tendinopathy wasn't very common in soccer players, particularly compared to Achilles and patella tendinopathy. As far as I'm aware, that's the only data that's available on the prevalence of the condition. However, so we don't really know. I'd be interested in looking at that further. And, as a clinician, definitely is focused, as you're saying, in a couple main groups. So,
So, I think it's as we've been sort of saying, it's just a it's a wide open area, hamstring. And one thing I was fascinated with your, going back to your review, I was just fascinated with just the level of just, can we call it crap, that is out there, and the lack of evidence in this area. Do you want to just comment on what you found quality-wise and interventions they were looking at?
Yeah, I mean, they were looking at a lot of different interventions. So I think there were only 2 randomized control trials, and both were, really, I guess, low quality. The most renowned, I guess, RCT was a study by Kasia, I think in 2011 it was published, and they compared shockwave therapy to a multimodal program. But, like you're saying, with this condition, it's really hard to recruit patients because, it's not that common. And so, they only had 20 participants per group. That was probably, I guess, one of the higher quality studies. A lot of the lower quality studies were on I guess the case series, I should say, were on surgery and the effect of surgery over time. So, we don't have a control group, so it's really hard to get a really good idea of the actual true kind of effect.
So, because I noticed with your review, and what I meant by crap was that you've got more research quality was poor, because a lot of it, as you say, there was only 2 trials and the rest were cohort studies. What would be your advice to, say, clinicians out there when you say you've got a hamstring tendon patient? Obviously, we really don't know, do we, what to do with them? Is it just going back to basic principles of how you'd manage MSK, persistent conditions? Is there, or what should we consider?
Yeah, so I guess the second study of my PhD was a qualitative study where we asked experts from around the world how they, assess and manage the condition. And so we found that they, all the experts use very similar principles to how we generally manage other tendinopathies like the Achilles and patella tendon. So focusing on, progressing, as you were saying, through, our principles of rehabilitation, starting with lower load exercise for the tendon in, positions of minimal hip flexion that are often, really well tolerated, and then and really focusing on then building up their strength. We often find, that these patients have really marked deficits in their, knee flexion strength, particularly if they've had the condition for a really long period of time. So really trying to isolate and progress their strength. So I guess treating those impairments with a really targeted loading program, as opposed to a more non-specific loading program, just like you would with an Achilles or a patella tendinopathy as well.
Mm. Yeah, and that's really good advice, I think, for people out there looking for some clinical, takeaways and things that they can use for this problem where there's not the evidence base that we need. And it's really reassuring that the experts were sort of similar. As you say, you were able to find similarities. And that is published in Physical Therapy in Sports. I definitely recommend reading that. That's the expert physiotherapist perspectives. So moving on then to the rest of your PhD, you did a lot of work setting or thinking about core outcomes, domains, and then thinking about core outcome set for proximal hamstring tendon. Do you want to give us a brief summary of what you found with that?
Yeah, so a lot of this research occurred on the background of the ICON, tendinopathy consensus, which took place in 2018, and following that, there are a number of publications, and particularly on, I guess the aim was about improving the quality of research conducted in tendinopathy. And what we found in our systematic review was that, different authors use different inclusion criteria. So how they defined a patient with proximal hamstring tendinopathy was different from study to study, or just really unclearly reported. And so the other thing was that they used very inconsistent outcome measures. So a lot of the studies used outcome measures that had previously been, I guess, designed for hip osteoarthritis or other hip conditions to evaluate proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So on the background of that, we looked at evaluating, outcome measures used in proximal hamstring tendinopathy, and we started to develop a core outcome, or try to develop a core outcome set for proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So that involves multiple steps, and I'm actually still completing that. But the first step is just simply understanding what outcome measures are being used in the literature. So our systematic review that I'd spoken about earlier was used to collect them with a bit of an updated search, and then asking, experts about, their views on different outcome measures, and then analysing their measurement properties. So we followed special guidelines called the Cosman guidelines, which I think stands for the consensus-based standards for the selection of health measurement properties. And they talk about things like, the validity, the responsiveness, the reliability of different measures. And so we then were able to analyse the quality of these outcome measures, and then provide, recommendations back to experts. Then involve, patients to make sure that that the outcome measures that we use are, truly applicable to them, and ensure that we do, meet all of the different. We have an outcome measure to measure each of the 9 tendinopathy domains, which were, established in that consensus that I spoke about earlier.
Fantastic. And you say that that is still ongoing work. You have published the core outcome set development. Protocol.
Yeah.
You're still waiting for publication of the actual core outcome set. Is that right? Yeah.
So we've got another paper on the clinometric properties of the outcome measures under review. And then I then need to conduct interviews with patients with proximal hamstring tendinopathy, and then take those results back to the experts. And hopefully from there, I'll be able to publish the core outcome set. So there's actually a little bit of work left to do on that project. Hope to conduct this year.
I can appreciate that. It's a huge amount of work. We're doing a similar thing for Achilles tendon. and it's a massive amount of work, especially all the systematic reviews you need to do for clinometric properties and
they are a lot of
going
work.
back to the patients, going back, as you say, to the experts, and then reaching consensus. So where you're at is clinometric properties, and then next stage is involving the patients and clinical experts again, and then getting to some sort of consensus, which ultimately will be really good because it will guide the outcomes we use clinically, but also in research. How far off do you think you are with all that?
Coming up with a core outcome set?
Yeah, just publication of the core outcome set, where people can use
I'm
it.
hoping for next year,
fantastic.
So hopefully to be able to publish at least a recommendation of different outcome measures that can be used as a minimum in future research next year.
Yeah, that's great, Anthony. So that's good. Really, really interesting work, and I've really appreciated the opportunity to talk to you about this. And as I say, I will get through the whole thesis, and I might do some other talking tendons on some of the outputs that you've had. But just wanted to ask you a last question. And obviously, this is a wide open area, and you seem to be very engaged in moving it forward, which is really, really good. What else, aside from the outcome stuff, do you think we need some trials, or what else? What other directions would you suggest going into without giving away all your secrets?
No, that's fine. So I guess it really is a blank canvas. So ideally, we'll have some valid and reliable outcome measures that we can recommend for use. And from there, I guess it would then make sense to conduct a clinical trial using, validated outcome measures to figure out, what our best management strategy is. We completed that, qualitative study. And so potentially using principles of management used by experts to compare, an intervention against another intervention would be a great area. But then there's also the other area of, inclusion criteria as well. And I feel like with proximal hamstring tendinopathy, because, sometimes I feel like the diagnosis is really clear, but, potentially with people conducting research all around the world, it would be really good to be able to agree on, the inclusion criteria for patients with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So potentially performing, some diagnostic accuracy studies. There's one, real study available at the moment. However, it does have some limitations. So I think they're all really, great steps that I'd like to, pursue in the future.
I think that's going to keep you busy for a long, long time. And it's really important work. We're doing a diagnostic consensus for Achilles diagnosis at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So, and that's I have actually, and I know that you guys, having spoken to some people in your team, might be going down a similar path, which I think is really good. So that's good. But I like the approach of, and this is a good lesson for everyone out there, and even for me, because you don't always do this, but slowing down a bit and just doing the basics first, i.e. getting the outcome measures sorted before you then move on to trials and other things. Doing things in a systematic way, I think, and you've got the opportunity to do that now because you're starting off in this proximal hamstring tendon area where there's not many trials. If you look at all the Achilles ones, a lot of them are not very useful because, as you say, the outcome measures are different and the criteria for inclusion and diagnosis is different. So if we can start and do things systematically, I think it will make a difference. So I think this is really important. That's great, Anthony. Thank you once again very much for coming on to the podcast. Is there anything you want to share about where people can find out more about you or your research?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, so at OnlyNASAPT. And then if you want to contact me about any research, or you're interested in conducting any research, particularly on tendinopathies around the hip. I'm at anthony.nasser@uts.com.au.
Fantastic. I think you'll need about 3 or 4 PhD students to do some of the work that you have outlined there. So please contact Tony if you're interested in doing a PhD on hip tendons. Fantastic. Thanks very much for coming on, Tony. Speak to you next time.
Thanks, Peter.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.